Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another Mr. Farney Earth Science video. If you are here, then you are, in fact, in the right spot for our first video for our earthquake unit. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, Mr. Farney, we live in Pennsylvania. Why do I care about earthquakes? Well, even though we are nowhere near a fault zone, like our divergent faults or convergent faults, there are still several fault areas that are deep underground relative to us in Pennsylvania. We had an earthquake not too long ago in Berks County, not too far from where we are located. And earthquakes do happen in locations far away from fault lines. Sometimes because of man-made activities such as fracking can cause earthquake activity, but we'll get to that later on. Our purposes of this video is just to kind of introduce everybody into what earthquakes are, what we'll be talking about for our earthquake unit, and learn some of the basic terminologies. That way we're able to maneuver through some of the material a little easier. So big idea, what are earthquakes? They are neutral vibrations, or natural vibrations, I should say, of the ground, some of which are caused by the movement along fractures in the Earth's crust. This is the big idea of earthquakes. They're natural vibrations. They occur all around the world. They've occurred on every single one of the 7 continents in some way, shape, or form, but they are all caused by movement around fracture zones in the Earth's crust. Here are some questions that we're going to cover in our unit here. We're going to talk about what causes earthquakes, where do they naturally occur, how do scientists study earthquakes, how do scientists use seismic waves to study the interior of the Earth. That one is really important. That's how we know that the Earth's inner and outer core, they're made out of 2 different types of materials. That's how we know the asthenosphere is not solid. It's that very mandible material that we can use. How are earthquakes located and measured? We'll talk a little bit about triangulation and how scientists go about doing that. And then ultimately, are we able to predict earthquakes, or are there some indicators that can let us know that an earthquake is going to happen in some location? These are our essential questions that we will be talking about throughout our earthquake unit. So firstly, what we're talking about today is just earthquake basics. And there's nothing more basic than the main idea of earthquakes, in which faults form when the forces acting on a rock exceed the rock's strength. What does that mean? Well, we have different forces interacting along opposite sides of a fault line. Like imagine like the space between my 2 hands here is a fault line. In my right hand and my left hand, there's forces causing them to go in different directions. Maybe they're causing them to push apart. Maybe the forces are causing them to push together. Maybe they're sliding past each other. These movements sound familiar. In plate tectonics, we use the word convergent, divergent, transform to describe plate movement. In this unit, and this is something that we're going to want to make sure that we differentiate, in this unit, we're not going to use the terms convergent, divergent, and transform. We have a whole new slew of terminology to describe localized movement on opposite sides of a fault line, and we'll get to that in a minute. So here are some pictures of some earthquakes, or I should say, you can't really picture an earthquake unless you look at a seismograph. These are the effects of earthquakes. One of the things that modern technology is working toward is trying to build roads and bridges and buildings to better withstand earthquake vibrations. Modern buildings and modern bridges, they're built to sway as opposed to crumble. So that way they have a little give and they kind of move along with that seismic wave generated from the earthquake. So modern technology and construction is leading to an increased likelihood that we'll have fewer damaging shocks like this in the future, especially in our earthquake-prone areas. The issue is there's a lot of already existing infrastructure that is not built to withstand the strength of some of these earthquakes. So that is what we are trying to get past as far as development issues goes. So what is an earthquake? An earthquake is the shaking of Earth's crust. It's caused by a sudden release of energy from breaking of rocks beneath the surface. We can't talk about earthquakes unless we talk about stress and strain. Stress is the total force acting on rocks, while strain is used to describe how that rock deforms in response to stress. How do we visualize this? If you take your hands and cup them like this. And then if you start pulling on them without letting go of your fingers, you'll feel a lot of stress starting to form. If you apply more and more to it, your fingers might start to bend in weird directions. That's the strain. Rock material on opposite sides of a fault line, the same thing happens. Sometimes maybe they're sliding past each other, they get caught, and then they still want to move. That stress is forcing them to bend in odd shapes that they wouldn't normally do until they quickly break and separate. And it's that separation movement, that quick rebound from the plates unsticking that causes the earthquake. So we have a strong stress being applied to the rocks. The stress creates strain that maybe makes them deform a little bit. And then once that stress is released, we get an earthquake. This right here just overviews a little bit about what we just said. When the stress overcomes the strength of the rocks involved, movement occurs along the fracture zones of that rock material. So when that stress, this is the stress, when it overcomes how strong those rocks are, or that sticking point is, movement occurs, we get an earthquake. But if that stress begins to create strain, like we said on the last slide here, we can get two different types of deformations. We can get an elastic deformation where the material is either compressed, it's bent, it's stretched, or we can have a plastic deformation where that stress builds up past the elastic point and it actually will snap or will permanently deform that rock material. So we have elastic deformation, we have plastic deformation. Elastic, if you want to think about it like this, elastic is bending, like, oh no, it's causing my paper to bend. But then after the earthquake happens, it might go back to the way it was. Plastic deformation is, oh no, my paper is bending, but then I tear down the middle of the paper. And then after the earthquake happens, it's no longer able to get back to the way or the shape or the form that it was before that stress was acting upon it. So it's a big difference between elastic and plastic deformation. Here are three types of stresses that we're going to care about. We have compression, where the rock material on other sides of that fault are pushing toward each other. Kind of reminds you a little bit about one of our plate movements here. You know, not divergent, but convergent. So compression reminds us of convergent, where our rock material is being pushed together. Tension reminds me of that divergent boundary. They're slowly being pulled apart. Shear reminds me a little bit about the transform, where they're sliding past each other. But when we're talking faults and we're talking earthquakes and we're talking stresses, we're going to use compression, tension, and shear to be our descriptor words of what's going on these fault lines with this rock material. So this takes us to this idea of what is elastic rebound. Well, if we talked about elastic and plastic deformation, what does it mean to elastically rebound? Well, I'm going to go back to my orange notepad here. If there's stress being put upon this, where my material is being pushed together like this, and then the earthquake happens and energy release, the rebound is the movement to go back to the way it was before. It returns to the normal position, but the rock material might be shifted. If we look at the pictures on screen here, this might provide a slightly better understanding. Make sure you pay attention to how the rock material looks on the left and to the right of our fault line in the middle here. Each of these are being forced to go in opposite directions. After enough stress is applied and they don't want to move, you see how there's a slight bending in the rock, so it's no longer perfectly horizontal. That bending, that is our elastic deformation that's occurring here because the stress is being applied to the rocks. After that snapping motion occurs, that energy is released, the rock material on other sides of that fault line, they return to their original orientation. They're just shifted slightly. This springing back motion, that's that rebound that can occur. That's that elastic rebound. So this is really important that happens in earthquakes and allows scientists to better study what's going on in the overall movement of the earthquakes themselves. Different faults, we've used that word fault in here today. What is a fault? It's a break or a crack in the Earth's crust where movement has occurred. It's that simple. There's 3 different fault types that we're going to talk about. The first one is a normal fault. This is a fault where both sides of my rock material on other side of a plane, they're moving in opposite directions. Makes sense. This tension or this stress that's being applied to them are pulling them apart from this fault line. It's a normal fault. My plate, I shouldn't say my plates, I'm sorry. My rock material is moving in opposite directions. Well, if we have a normal fault, we're going to talk reverse. If we're compressing the material, if we're compressing the rocks on either side of this fault line right there, they're going to push toward each other. They're going to compress toward each other. So a normal fault, they're moving away. Reverse fault, my rock material is moving toward each other. They're being compressed. Lastly, a strike slip. This is where rock material on opposite sides of the plane, they're going in opposite directions caused by different shear forces. So we have normal faults where they're moving apart. We have reverse faults where they're moving toward each other. We have strike slip where they're sliding past. That right there is where we're going to end our discussion today. And that's a lot of things we threw at you in once. We have different types of faults like our strike slip, a reverse fault, our normal fault. We talked about generally what is a fault. We spoke about elastic rebound. We spoke about our different stresses that are applied. We have compression, tension, and shear. We spoke about elastic deformation, plastic deformation, and then overall, what is an earthquake and how do the stresses and strains applied to it cause the shaking, the vibrations that we see day to day? So that is our good introduction for earthquakes. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. Reach out to me. I'll get back to you as soon as I see your message. If not, have a great rest of your day, and we'll check back with you in our next video. We're going to talk about different types of seismic waves. Very exciting, I know. Okay, have a great rest of your day. We'll take care. Okay, bye-bye.